Exterior forest. Night. There are two people in the forest. They are Erica Reed and Bryant Blake. They are in the process of setting up camp. The date is June 23, 2006. Erica Reed says,
"Why in the ancient worlds did you choose this location?"
Bryant Blake says,
"I have read that this place was known for its scenery."
Erica Reed says,
"You're just trying to flirt with me."
Bryant Blake says,
"Yes."
Erica Reed says,
"It seems to be working."
Bryant Blake says.
"That is good to hear."
The pair completed setting up the tent. They enter the tent. Bryant starts putting the moves on Erica. Bryant Blake says,
"So, now that we're all set up, let's get down to business."
Erica Reed says,
"All right."
The pair start getting undressed. A moaning sound could be heard. Zombie O.S. says, Erica Reed says,
"Wait a minute. I hear something."
Bryant Blake says,
"Hey, you're right."
Erica Reed says,
"What should we do?"
Bryant Blake says,
"I have an idea. You stay right here."
Erica Reed says,
"Understood."
Bryant puts his clothes back on. He also picks up a flashlight. Bryant Blake says,
"All right, whoever you are, show yourself."
Bryant starts moving the flashlight. Bryant Blake says,
"That's strange. I don't see anything."
Bryant swings around to see a zombie. Bryant Blake says,
"Wah, what are you?"
Zombie says,
ARR, brains.
The zombie slowly moves towards Bryant. Bryant Blake says,
"Stay away from me."
The zombie lunges at Bryant. He grabs Bryant and bites into his head. Bryant Blake says,
Ah.
Erica rushes out of the tent. She had just gotten her clothes back on. She sees Bryant and the zombie. Erica Reed says,
"Awk."
Erica freezes up as she sees the zombie eat Bryant's brain. Bryant falls to the ground. The zombie turns to face Erica. Erica Reed says,
"Stay away from me."
Erica starts backing away. The zombie starts slowly moving towards her. Erica Reed says,
"AIEE."
Erica starts running even faster. She also occasionally looking behind her. She doesn't notice that there is a small tree that had recently fallen. She trips over the tree. Erica Reed says,
"Damn it."
Erica holds her left leg, which was injured. She doesn't notice the zombie creep up behind her. She turns to see the zombie. Erica Reed says,
AIEE.
The zombie pounces on Erica. The zombie starts chomping down on her. Quick cut, angle on. Outside of forest, the screams of Erica Reed could be heard. SFX, the screams of Erica Reed and the zombie eating her. Cut to, interior forest, day. It is now June 24, 2006. A day has passed since Erica Reed and Bryant Blake were attacked by the zombie. There is a small search party in the area. They are accompanied by a couple of police officers from the neighboring city of Astrocane. Police officer number 1 says,
"I don't see the bodies."
Police officer number 2 says,
"They have to be here somewhere."
Search party member number 1 says,
"He's right."
The search party is searching for the bodies. One of the police officers sees the campsite. They also find some blood. Police officer number 1 says,
"Hey, I see the campsite."
Police officer number 2 says,
"Good, let's inform Sheriff Knowles."
Police officer number 1 says,
"Roger that."
Police officer number 1 calls Sheriff Grover Knowles. He informs Sheriff Grover Knowles about the situation. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Roger that. I'm on my way.
Sheriff Grover Knowles proceeds to the location. He soon arrives at the location. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Well then. It seems that you're right.
Police officer number 1 says,
"What shall we do now?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles notices something to the south of the campsite. It is a piece of cloth. The piece of cloth was from Erica's shorts. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Here's another clue.
Police officer number 1 says,
"What is it?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
It is a piece of cloth. I suspect that it came from one of our victims.
Sheriff Grover Knowles points to the bloodstain. Police officer number 1 says,
"I see what you mean, sir."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Yes, it seems that one of our victims was bitten in the area.
Police officer number 2 says,
"Bitten, sir? What makes you think that?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
I can see a small fragment of a tooth.
Police officer number 1 says,
"How the hell did you see that?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
It's faint, but noticeable.
Police officer number 1 says,
"I see it now. That leaves only one question."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
2 actually. The first is obviously the identity of our victim.
Police officer number 2 says,
"The other must be who bit the victim, and why."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Exactly. Although I suspect a zombie might be involved.
Police officer number 1 says,
"A zombie, sir."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Yes,
The search party proceed with the rest of the search. Cut 2, exterior Camp Fallen Oak entrance. Day. Huck Abberton, 32, a camp counselor, was nearby. He was watching for the buses that are transporting the campers to the camp. Huck Abberton says,
"This is such a great day."
Cagner Gashnak, 37, a camp counselor, arrives on the scene. Cagner Gashnak says,
"Why is it that you do this every year?"
Huck Abberton says,
"Old times, mainly. It's been years since I attended summer camp."
Cagner Gashnak says,
"You humans are weird."
Huck Abberton says,
"What makes you so sure?"
Cagner Gashnak says,
"Us orcs are natural warriors. We do not have need for such things as summer camp."
Huck Abberton says,
"Oh really now?"
Cagner Gashnak says,
"Yes."
Huck sees the buses begin to arrive. They immediately come into view. Cut 2, interior bus. Day. Luke David Copeland and Dwayne Chris Patton are sitting in the seat at the rear right section of the bus. Luke David Copeland says,
Hey, Dwayne.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
What is it, Luke?
Luke David Copeland says,
I was thinking that you should go out with Molly Tweedledee.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Do you really think that I have a chance?
Luke David Copeland says,
Of course. I'm absolutely certain you have a chance. You might also get a chance to score.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
In that case, I shall do so.
The buses pull over to the nearby parking lot. They come to a complete stop. Bus driver says,
All right, boys and girls. Time to get off the bus.
The campers proceed to pick up their belongings. They also leave the bus. Huck and Cagner go over to greet the campers. Huck Abberton says,
"Greetings, all. Welcome to Camp Fallen Oak."
Cagner Gashnak says,
"Seriously, greetings, all. You humans have such weird phrases and sayings."
Huck and Cagner lead the campers. One of the first stops was the camp counselor's office. Begin opening titles, over opening credits, end opening credits, end opening titles. Huck and Cagner show the campers to their cabins. Luke and Dwayne are assigned to cabin number 1. Interior cabin number 1. Day. Luke David Copeland says,
Hey Dwayne.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
What is it, Luke?
Luke David Copeland says,
Did you ask her out?
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Yes.
Luke David Copeland says,
What did she say?
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
She said yes.
Luke David Copeland says,
Excellent.
Luke and Dwayne were squaring away their gear. Luke also proceeds to congratulate Dwayne. Cut 2, interior cabin number 5. Day. Molly Tweedledee and Juliet Michael are in the cabin. They are in the process of setting up their stuff. Juliet Michael says,
So, how did it go with Dwayne Chris Patton?
Molly Tweedledee says,
It went well.
Juliet Michael says,
What's he like?
Molly Tweedledee says,
He seems pretty nice.
Juliet Michael says,
So, when's the first date?
Molly Tweedledee says,
It's going to be later today.
Cut 2, exterior cabin number 5. Day. Zombies POV. There is a zombie hiding outside the cabin. Zombie says,
Grr. Arg.
Juliet Michael says,
Did you hear something?
Molly Tweedledee says,
Yeah, I heard something.
Molly and Juliet look out the window. Molly Tweedledee says,
That's odd. I don't see anything.
Juliet Michael says,
I have to agree.
Molly and Juliet head back inside the cabin. Cut 2, exterior baseball field. Day. Wallace Raymond, 33, a camp counselor, was participating in a baseball game. He was the captain of one of the two teams. Latasha Sheena Douglas, 34, another camp counselor, was the captain of the other team. Wallace Raymond says,
Give the next pitch some heat, Cedric.
Cedric Solstein proceeds to throw the next pitch. He manages to get a strike against Orville Kane. Camper says,
Strike 1.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
All right, Orville, you can still get a home run.
Orville Kane says,
I'm gonna do this.
Cedric catches the ball that was thrown by the catcher. He proceeds to throw another pitch. Orville proceeds to hit the ball. Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
Now's your chance.
Orville proceeds to run the bases. The opposing team just managed to get the ball. Orville manages to score a triple play. 10. Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
Great work, Orville. We're now up by 1 point.
Cut 2, exterior archery range. Day. Nanarock Greenstar, 230, a camp counselor, was giving a demonstration on archery. She hits a bullseye on the center target. Nanarock Greenstar says,
That's how it's done.
Nanarock Greenstar proceeds to step aside. Lirahan Whitelight, one of the campers, steps up to the spot. Nanarock Greenstar says,
Now it's your turn.
Lirahan Whitelight says,
Understood.
Lirahan proceeds to take out an arrow. She readies her bow. She pulls the bowstring. She steadies her aim. Nanarok Greenstar says.
Now, just release the bowstring.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
Understood.
Lirahan proceeds to release the bowstring. SFX, the twang of the bowstring snapping back into place. The arrow goes flying through the air. It hits the bullseye of the target at the other end of the range. Nanarok Greenstar says.
Great work, Lirahan.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
Thank you.
Nanarok sees something in the forest. It is a zombie. Nanarok Greenstar says.
This can't be good.
11. Camper says.
What is it?
Nanarok Greenstar says.
I just thought that I had seen something.
Cut to Interior Camp Kitchen. Day. Nez Darkburner, Gavri Azarov, and Julio Alvarado are there. Gavri Azarov says.
So, as I was saying, I was at the western region with Ilya.
Nez Darkburner says.
Oh great, here he goes again.
Julio Alvarado says.
It can't all be bad.
Nez Darkburner says.
What the hell are you talking about?
Julio Alvarado says.
Gavri's family has a great history of service in the country of Russia.
Nez Darkburner says.
I guess you do have a point.
Julio was tending to his role as a janitor. Cut to Exterior Lake. Day. Kuroshi Ragaran and Bremax Bonesteel are out in a canoe. They are participating in a canoe race. Their opponents were Nehika Windclaw and Luke David Copeland. Kuroshi Ragaran says.
Are you sure we can win?
Bremax Bonesteel says.
I'm sure of it.
12. Dwayne Chris Patton and Molly Tweedleby are on the dock. They are cheering on their friends. Dwayne Chris Patton says.
Come on, Luke. I know you can do it.
Molly Tweedleby says.
You seem to have a lot of faith in your friend.
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
Of course. Luke and I go back a long way.
Molly Tweedleby says.
How long?
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
We were friends since we first met back in grade 6.
Molly Tweedleby says.
When was that?
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
That was back in 2001.
Molly Tweedleby says.
That is rather interesting.
Cut to Exterior Hiking Trail. Day. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter, 31, one of the camp counselors, is leading a group of campers on a hiking trip. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Remember kids, this is just first trip.
Camper number 1 says.
This is rather interesting.
Tamara proceeds to lead the group. They finish the hiking trip. Tamara and the group head towards the dining hall. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Well then, there's the bell.
13. Tamara and the group enter the hall. They are greeted by Gavri. Gavri Azarov says.
Greetings all.
Huck and Kagner enter the dining hall. Huck Abberton, we're now here. Kagner Gashnak says.
You humans are definitely weird.
Gavri Azarov says.
Hey, Kagner.
Kagner Gashnak says.
Oh great.
Nez Darkburner says.
It can't all be bad.
Julio Alvarado says.
Of course. Gavri may get a bit carried away with his stories, but he means well.
The group proceeds to eat their lunch. They soon finish up. They leave the hall. Cut to Exterior River. Afternoon. There are 2 campers in the area. They had just shown up. Camper number 1 says.
This is great.
Camper number 2 says.
Oh, you know it.
Camper number 1 says.
I remember one time I had caught a large bass.
Camper number 2 says.
How large was it, Cyrus?
Cyrus Mosley says.
It was about 5 feet in length, Alyssa.
14. Alyssa Sanford says.
5 feet.
Cryas Mosley says.
Yes. Striped bass have a maximum length of 6 feet.
Alyssa Sanford says.
Oh really now?
Cyrus Mosley says.
Yes.
Alyssa hears something. It is a zombie. The pair had placed their fishing gear on the ground. Alyssa Sanford says.
That can't be good.
Cyrus and Alyssa had started fishing. They cast their fishing lines. They didn't notice that there is a zombie creeping up behind him. Zombie says.
Raw.
The zombie chomps down on the back of Cyrus's head. Alyssa sees the zombie. Alyssa Sanford says.
AIE.
The zombie kills Cyrus. The zombie proceeds to attack Alyssa. Alyssa manages to knock the zombie's head off. She doesn't notice that she was bitten by the zombie. The zombie's headless body stumbles back into the forest. Alyssa Sanford says.
Somebody help.
Wallace Raymond was the first person to hear the calls. He comes running over. Wallace Raymond says.
What seems to be the problem?
Alyssa Sanford says.
Cyrus and I were attacked by something. It killed him.
15. Wallace Raymond says.
Here, let me help you up.
Wallace helps Alyssa. Gavri and Kagner show up. Gavri Azarov says.
What's the situation?
Wallace Raymond says.
Alyssa said that she and Cyrus were attacked by something.
Gavri Azarov says.
Something.
Wallace Raymond says.
Yes.
Gavri Azarov says.
Could you get a description of the person?
Alyssa Sanford says.
The person seemed to be decayed. It was shuffling around.
The group is traveling to the infirmary. Gavri Azarov says.
Decayed. Shuffling around. That can only mean one thing.
The group arrive at the infirmary. Ruparil Jatalka, the nurse, is waiting there for them. Ruparil Jatalka says.
What's the situation?
Wallace Raymond says. Alyssa said that she and Cyrus were attacked by a thing. Gavri Azarov says.
From what she said, the description seems to indicate a zombie.
Huck Abberton says.
A zombie?
16. Gavri Azarov says.
Yes. She said that the thing was decayed and shuffling around.
Huck Abberton says.
That can't be good.
Huck thinks of something. Huck Abberton says.
Hey, Kagner.
Kagner Gashnak says.
What is it, human?
Huck Abberton says.
Didn't your cousin fight against a horde of undead?
Kagner Gashnak says.
Yes, Norgak Gorbash had fought as part of the Shadow Wolf clan. He was in the dimension of Octiviax.
Huck Abberton says.
When was that?
Kagner Gashnak says.
That was in May of 2000.
Ruparil Jatalka says.
Do you guys mind?
Kagner Gashnak says.
Understood.
Huck Abberton says.
Understood.
Wallace and Gavri help Alyssa to the medical table. Ruparil proceeds to perform an examination on Alyssa. Ruparil Jatalka says.
Oh dear, this isn't good.
Huck Abberton says.
What is it?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
I don't see any life signs. I don't hear a heartbeat. I'm not getting a pulse.
17. Huck Abberton says.
This isn't good.
Alyssa Sanford says.
What does that mean?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
That means that you are technically dead.
Alyssa Sanford says.
Oh dear God, no.
Alyssa starts crying. Gavri, Huck, Wallace, and Ruparil go over to the corner. Wallace Raymond says.
What shall we do now?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
She's still alive.
Kagner Gashnak says.
It's only a matter of time when she dies and rises as a zombie.
Huck Abberton says.
We can't just kill her.
Gavri Azarov says.
I have to agree with Huck.
Wallace Raymond says.
I have an idea.
Huck Abberton says.
What is it?
Wallace Raymond says.
This is going to be a hard plan.
Huck Abberton says.
What the hell are you talking about?
Wallace Raymond says.
There's a shed nearby.
Huck Abberton says.
Are you saying that we lock her in there?
18. Wallace Raymond says.
Yes.
Huck Abberton says.
What the hell's wrong with you?
Wallace Raymond says.
You do realize that she's going to become a zombie.
Gavri Azarov says.
He does have a point.
Wallace Raymond says.
When she does transform, she wouldn't be able to harm anyone.
Huck Abberton says.
I'm starting to see your point.
Huck goes over to Alyssa. Huck Abberton says.
Alyssa.
Alyssa Santho 0RD says.
Yes, Mr. Abberton.
Huck Abberton says.
This is going to be hard to say, but...
Alyssa Sanford says.
You want to keep me separated from the rest of the campers, in case I turn into a zombie.
Huck Abberton says.
Yes.
Alyssa Sanford says.
In that case, I shall comply.
Wallace heads Alyssa over to the shed behind the infirmary. Wallace Raymond says.
I'm sure that you'll be just fine.
Alyssa enters the shed. Wallace proceeds to close the door. He also locks the door. 19. Huck Abberton says.
Are you certain we're doing the right thing?
Wallace Raymond says.
I'm sure of it. It's for her own good.
Cut 2. Exterior path. Afternoon. There are 2 people on the path. They are Denny Ortega and Sharon Hudson, 2 campers. Sharon Hudson says.
Are you sure this is a good idea?
Denny Ortega says.
Of course. They weren't able to find the creature.
Sharon Hudson says.
Creature.
Denny Ortega says.
Of course. From what I had heard, they were able to defeat it.
Sharon Hudson says.
I just hope you're right.
Denny and Sharon see a spot off the path. They exchange glances. Denny Ortega says.
This looks like a good spot.
Sharon Hudson says.
You know it.
Denny and Sharon proceed to the spot. They start taking off their clothes. They start making out. They proceed to have sex. They don't notice that there is a zombie in the area. Zombie's POV. The zombie was creeping up on the 2 lovers. The zombie proceeds to pounce on the pair. The zombie proceeds to devour the couple. Quick cut. 20. Wide shot. Path. The screams of the couple could be heard. A geyser of blood starts rising. Cut 2. Interior infirmary. Afternoon. Wallace returned to the infirmary. Huck Abberton says.
What do we do now?
Wallace Raymond says.
It's only a matter of time before she transforms.
Latasha runs into the room. Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Come quick. There's a problem at the outdoor theater.
Huck Abberton says.
This can't be good.
Huck, Gavri, Wallace, Cagner, and Ruperiel head to the outdoor theater. Exterior outdoor theater. Afternoon. The 5 counselors arrive at the outdoor theater. Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
"This was what I was talking about."
Latasha points to the stage. Huck Abberton says,
"Damn it. It looks like we have more dead on our hands."
Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
"What shall we do now?"
Huck Abberton says,
"There's a shed behind the infirmary."
21. Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
"I get it now. You intend to store the corpses there."
Huck Abberton says,
"Yes. That way, when they come back as zombies, they will not be able to get out and eat anyone."
Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
"Zombies. Are you serious?"
Huck Abberton says,
"I'm afraid so. In fact, one of our campers was already killed by a zombie."
Gavri Azarov says,
Yes. Another one was beaten, but it's only a matter of time before she turns into an undead.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says,
"This is serious."
Huck Abberton says,
"Yes."
Wallace Raymond says,
All right, let's get the 2 corpses to the shed.
Cagner and Wallace proceed to pick up the corpses. Huck Abberton says,
"This is shaping up to be a bad day."
Cagner Gashnak says,
If only you know, human.
Huck Abberton says,
"What are you talking about?"
Cagner Gashnak says,
It only takes one zombie to cause problems.
Huck Abberton says,
"Hopefully, we're in the early stages of a zombie attack."
22. Cagner Gashnak says,
What in the hell are you talking about?
Huck Abberton says,
"We can still stop the outbreak."
Cagner Gashnak says,
I just hope you're right, human.
Cagner and Wallace arrive at the shed. Wallace looks inside the shed through the window. Wallace Raymond says,
Huck, I have some bad news.
Huck Abberton says,
"What are you talking about?"
Wallace Raymond says,
Alyssa Sanford has died.
Huck Abberton says,
"This is just great."
Gavri Azarov says,
What shall we do now?
Huck Abberton says,
"We still place the corpses in the shed."
Wallace Raymond says,
Are you crazy?
Huck Abberton says,
"I was thinking that we place the corpses in there."
Wallace Raymond says,
What if Alyssa has turned into a zombie?
Huck Abberton says,
"I was thinking that we would act quickly."
Gavri Azarov says,
We should have something in place, should she come back as a zombie.
23. Huck Abberton says,
"You do have a point."
Huck goes over to the dock. He grabs a paddle. He returns back to the shed. Huck Abberton says,
"All right, I have a paddle."
Gavri Azarov says,
I get it now.
Huck Abberton says,
"Yes. We can use the paddle to keep the undead at bay."
Huck hands the paddle over to Gavri. Huck goes over to the shed door. Huck Abberton says,
"Wallace, Cagner."
Wallace Raymond says,
Yes, Huck.
Cagner Gashnak says,
Yes, Huck.
Huck Abberton says,
"I want you two to bring the corpses here. I'll unlock the door."
Huck turns to Gavri. Huck Abberton says,
"Gavri."
Gavri Azarov says,
Yes, Huck.
Huck Abberton says,
"I want you to stand here.
Huck points to the spot. Huck Abberton says,
When Alyssa comes out of the shed, you are to use the paddle."
Gavri Azarov says,
I get it now.
24. Huck takes the key out of his pocket. Huck Abberton says,
"Are you guys ready?"
Wallace Raymond says,
Yes.
Gavri Azarov says,
Yes.
Cagner Gashnak says,
Yes.
Huck proceeds to insert the key into the lock. He unlocks the door. Alyssa bolts right up. Cagner and Wallace attempt to place the corpses into the shed. Alyssa manages to escape. Gavri Azarov says,
Damn it, what are we going to do now?
Huck Abberton says,
"Let's try to catch the zombies before they cause more trouble."
Wallace Raymond says,
That sounds like a good idea.
Wallace turns to Gavri. Wallace Raymond says,
I'm surprised that you managed to fail such an easy task.
Gavri Azarov says,
You didn't do much better.
Wallace Raymond says,
Oh really now? I thought you said we're some retired Special Forces soldier.
Gavri Azarov says,
Former Spetsnaz actually.
Cagner Gashnak says,
I never knew you were a former Spetsnaz operative. What was your rank?
25. Gavri Azarov says,
Colonel.
Cagner Gashnak says,
Impressive.
Huck Abberton says,
"Do you mind?"
Wallace Raymond says,
I see your point.
The 5 counselors search for the escaped zombified Alyssa. They don't notice that the 2 dead campers have become zombies. Cut to exterior dock. Afternoon. Karoshi Ragaran and Bremax Bonesteel had won the canoe race. They are greeted by Nehika Windclaw and Luke David Copeland. Luke David Copeland says,
That was some race.
Karoshi Ragaran says,
Yes.
The 4 campers shake hands. Luke and Nehika leave the area. Karoshi and Bremax climb into a canoe. They proceed to start paddling out into the lake. Karoshi Ragaran says,
This is great.
Bremax Bonesteel says,
You know it.
A zombie pops out of the water. The zombie pulls Kuroshi underwater. Bremax Bonesteel says,
Karosh.
Bremax proceeds to dive into the water after her. He sees Kuroshi and the zombie. He swims over to Kuroshi in an attempt to free her from the zombie. He doesn't notice that there was another zombie in the area. Zombie says,
Wrath.
26. The zombie lunges on Bremax. The zombie starts chomping down on Bremax. The other zombie starts chomping down on Kuroshi. Cut to interior cabin number 5. Afternoon. Molly and Juliet were in their cabin. Juliet Michael says,
That was certainly interesting.
Molly Tweedledee says,
What are you talking about?
Juliet Michael says,
I heard from another one of the campers that there are zombies nearby.
Molly Tweedledee says,
You can't be serious.
Juliet Michael says,
I also heard that there were several deaths so far.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Several deaths.
Juliet Michael says,
Yes, as strange as it sounds, it's true.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Well, then I better tell Dwayne about this.
Juliet Michael says,
You mean Dwayne Chris Patton, your boyfriend.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Very funny.
Juliet Michael says,
I just hope you get to him in time.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Of course.
27. Molly exits the cabin. She goes over to cabin number 1. A couple of zombies come out of the nearby bushes. They proceed to grab her. Molly attempts to fight them, but is unsuccessful. They drag her off. Molly Tweedledee says,
AIEE. Somebody help.
The zombies drag her into the nearby bushes. Juliet hears the screams. She goes running to the scene of the abduction. Luke David Copeland arrives on the scene. Juliet Michael says,
I heard some screams here.
Luke David Copeland says,
Yes, it sounded like Molly Tweedledee.
Juliet Michael says,
Hey, you're right.
Luke David Copeland says,
That must mean.
Juliet Michael says,
She couldn't have been captured.
Luke David Copeland says,
From the looks of it, I would say that she was captured.
Juliet Michael says,
I'm starting to see your point.
Luke David Copeland says,
We should tell the camp counselors about this.
Juliet Michael says,
Good point.
Juliet and Luke head to the camp counselor's office. They see Julio in the office. Julio sees them. Julio Alvarado says,
How may I help you?
Juliet Michael says,
There are zombies in the area.
28. Luke David Copeland says,
Not only that, but Molly Tweedledee has gone missing.
Julio Alvarado says,
This is serious.
Julio proceeds to call Huck. Julio Alvarado says,
Hey, Huck.
Huck Abberton says,
What is it?
Julio Alvarado says,
We have a problem.
Huck Abberton says,
What kind of problem?
Julio Alvarado says,
One of our campers went missing. Not only that, there's reports of zombies.
Huck Abberton says,
One of the campers went missing.
Julio Alvarado says,
Yes, I'm afraid so.
Huck Abberton says,
Who is it?
Julio Alvarado says,
Molly Tweedledee.
Huck Abberton says,
This is just great.
29. Julio Alvarado says,
Of course.
Huck Abberton says,
Is there anything else?
Julio Alvarado says,
There was no traces of her.
Huck Abberton says,
No traces.
Julio Alvarado says,
I'm afraid so.
Huck Abberton says,
I can't believe this.
Julio Alvarado says,
This is serious.
Huck Abberton says,
I'll get the other counselors on the case.
Julio hangs up. He turns to Juliet and Luke. Juliet Michael says,
What did he say?
Julio Alvarado says,
Huck said that he's going to send some of the counselors to help search for Molly.
Juliet Michael says,
That's good to hear.
Luke David Copeland says,
Hopefully, they'll find her.
Juliet Michael says,
I hope you're right.
30. Cut to exterior forest. Afternoon. The zombies are taking Molly Tweedledee deeper into the forest. Molly Tweedledee says,
Where are you taking me?
Zombie number 1 says,
Ugh.
Zombie number 2 says,
Ooh.
Molly Tweedledee says,
It seems that I'm going nowhere with these two, at least in questioning them.
Molly notices something in the near distance. Molly Tweedledee says,
It seems that I'm being taken to an encampment of some sort.
Cut to exterior passage. Afternoon. Huck and the other camp counselors are searching for the zombified Alyssa Sanford. Wallace Raymond says,
What was that all about?
Huck Abberton says,
One of our campers went missing.
Gavri Azarov says,
Who is it?
Huck Abberton says,
Molly Tweedledee.
Wallace Raymond says,
Are you serious?
Huck Abberton says,
I'm afraid so.
31. Gavri Azarov says,
What are we going to do now?
Huck Abberton says,
We send a couple of counselors to help find her.
Wallace Raymond says,
That's a good idea. Who do we have?
Huck Abberton says.
We do have Nanaroke Greenstar and Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter.
Wallace Raymond says.
Good point.
Huck proceeds to call Tamara and Nanarock. He informs them about the situation. Nanarock Greenstar says.
Thanks for the info.
Nanarock turns to Tamara. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
What's the situation?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Huck told me that there have been reports of the undead around.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Undead. Are you serious?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
I'm afraid so.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Anything else?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Yes. It seems that one of the campers went missing.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Who is it?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Molly Tweedleby.
32. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Molly Tweedleby.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Yes.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Any idea where she went?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Huck said that she was taken somewhere to the forest south of here.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
We should do something about it.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Of course. That's why I have an idea.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
What are you talking about?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
I still have several bows and arrows at the archery range.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
I get it now.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Yes, we arm ourselves.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
There's just the problem of Molly's exact location.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Good point. Although I am an expert tracker.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
You're an expert tracker.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Yes, that was from my days in the forest kingdom of the elves.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Where is this forest kingdom of the elves?
33. Nanarock Greenstar says.
It's in the dimension of Octiviox.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Octiviox.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Wasn't there some sort of event involving the undead in the dimension?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Yes, that was several years ago.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
That's right.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Exactly.
Exterior archery range. Day. Nanarock and Tamara arrive at the archery range. Nanarock hears something. It is the sound of several zombies. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
What on earth was that?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Zombies.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
Zombies. Are you serious?
Nanarock Greenstar says.
I'm afraid so.
Nanarock motions to Tamara. Tamara heads into the storage shed. Nanarock is watching the zombies. Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
I have the bow and arrows.
Nanarock Greenstar says.
Good, because here they come.
The zombies come charging out of the woods. Tamara tosses Nanarock the bow and arrows. Nanarock takes aim at the zombies. She fires off several arrows. Each one hits the zombies. 34. Nanarock Greenstar says.
That should do it.
Another zombie charges out of the forest. The zombie lunges at Tamara. The zombie bites Tamara. Nanarock turns to see the situation. Nanarock Greenstar says.
By the gods.
Nanarock readies another arrow. She aims it at the zombie. Nanarock Greenstar says.
I'm sorry, Tamara.
Nanarock fires off another arrow. It hits the zombie in the head, killing it instantly. She runs over to Tamara. Nanarock Greenstar says.
There's still time to save you.
Tamara Anne-Marie Hunter says.
It's too late for me.
Tamara dies from her wounds. Nanarock pierces Tamara's skull, preventing her from turning into a zombie. Nanarock Greenstar says.
That should do it.
Nanarock proceeds to call Huck. She informs him about the situation. Cut to exterior pathway. Afternoon. Huck Abberton says.
This is just great.
Wallace Raymond says.
What is it?
Huck Abberton says.
Nanorch has just told me that Tamara has just died.
Wallace Raymond says.
What? Are you serious?
Huck Abberton says.
I'm afraid so.
35. Gavri Azarov says.
What are we going to do now?
Huck Abberton says.
What about Latasha?
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
That's right. I'll go help Nanarock.
Huck Abberton says.
Here. Have this. You may need this.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Where on earth did you get this?
Huck Abberton says.
It was over at the camp counselor's office.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
That's right. It didn't get much use.
Huck Abberton says.
Of course.
Latasha takes the walkie-talkie. She heads on her way over to Nanarock's location. Huck Abberton says.
Call me when you get vertical bar there.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Understood.
Huck proceeds to call Nanarock. He informs her about the situation. Nanarock Greenstar says.
Thanks for the info.
Huck Abberton says.
What's the situation on your end?
Nanorock Greenstar says.
I'm searching for Molly as we speak.
36. Huck Abberton says.
Any clue as to her current location?
Nanorock Greenstar says.
I suspect that she was taken down to the forest south of here.
Huck Abberton says.
Forest.
Nanorock Greenstar says.
Yes.
Huck Abberton says.
I had remembered hearing something about an investigation that took place there a while back.
Nanorock Greenstar says.
What are you talking about?
Huck Abberton says.
There was a film crew that was doing a documentary about recent sightings of the undead.
Nanorock Greenstar says.
Let me guess, they were killed by zombies.
Huck Abberton says.
Exactly.
Nanorock Greenstar says.
I'm surprised that they didn't fence off the area.
Huck Abberton says.
I would have to agree. Although the undead tend to find a way around these kinds of things.
Nanorock Greenstar says.
Why didn't they just try to torch the entire forest?
Huck Abberton says.
I'm surprised that they didn't try that idea. Although I suspect that a plan to do that with the forest may have been too impractical.
37. Nanorock Greenstar says.
Good point.
Nanorock is getting closer to the current location of Molly. Wallace Raymond says.
What do we do now?
Huck Abberton says.
We keep searching for Alyssa Sanford and the other campers.
Wallace Raymond says.
Good idea.
Gavri Azarov says.
What a dem s.
Kagner Gashnak says.
Yeah.
Wallace Raymond says.
Do you mind?
Huck Abberton says.
Besides, Wallace was only trying to ask a question.
Gavri Azarov says.
Oh really now?
Huck Abberton says.
Oh great, here we go vertical bar again.
Huck tries to settle the situation. Cut 2. Exterior edge of forest. Afternoon. Nanorock arrived at the edge of the forest. Latasha Sheena Douglas arrived at the area. Nanorock sees her. Nanorock Greenstar says.
So, you finally showed up.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Of course.
Nanorock sees that Latasha has a walkie-talkie. 38. Nanorock Greenstar says.
Huck wanted us to keep in touch during the search.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Exactly.
Nanorock and Latasha enter into the forest. Cut 2. Exterior forest. Afternoon. The zombies arrive at the encampment. They drop Molly to the ground. Molly Tweedledee says.
Now's my chance.
Voice OS says.
Not so fast.
Molly freezes in place. Molly Tweedledee says.
What in the ancient worlds?
Molly turns to see the zombie leader. Molly Tweedledee says.
What the hell is going on?
Zombie leader says.
You are wondering how I am able to talk while the other zombies don't.
Molly Tweedledee says.
That's one thing that I am wondering.
Zombie leader says.
Yes. What else?
Molly Tweedledee says.
Why have you brought me here?
Zombie says.
We want you to become our queen.
Molly Tweedledee says.
Your queen. That is so disgusting.
39. Zombie leader says.
Yes. As for how I am able to speak, it seems that I am a rarity amongst the zombies. The closest I can figure is that I still retain some of my humanity.
They don't notice that the 2 police officers from the search party are near the area. Police officer number 1 says.
Hey, Bruno.
Bruno Houston says.
What is it, Charlie?
Charlie Sargent says.
I think I may have found a huge lead.
Bruno Houston says.
What are you talking about?
Bruno Houston comes closer to Charlie Sargent's location. He sees what Charlie was talking about. Bruno Houston says.
That's not the person we're looking for.
Charlie Sargent says.
True. But from the looks of it, this may be the zombies' base of operations.
Bruno Houston says.
You may be onto something.
Charlie starts thinking of a plan. Charlie Sargent says.
Hey Bruno.
Bruno Houston says.
What is it?
Charlie Sargent says.
Do you see the shack at the north end of the encampment?
Bruno Houston says.
I see it.
40. Charlie Sargent says.
There must be something in there.
Bruno Houston says.
You're right.
Charlie Sargent says.
There must be other people in there.
Bruno Houston says.
You might be onto something.
Bruno and Charlie sneak over to the shack. They manage to sneak towards the north side of the shack. Bruno sees a window. Bruno Houston says.
There's a window.
Charlie Sargent says.
Look inside.
Bruno Houston says.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
Bruno looks through the window. He sees the contents of the shack. Bruno Houston says.
Charlie, you're not going to like this.
Charlie Sargent says.
What are you talking about?
Bruno Houston says.
There are no survivors in there. There are only pieces of the previous kills.
Charlie Sargent says.
What the hell are you talking about?
Charlie goes over to the window. He looks inside the shack. Charlie Sargent says,
What the hell is going on here?
41. Bruno Houston says,
From the looks of it, this is where the undead keep the remains of those they eat.
Charlie Sargent says,
There must be dozens of people here.
Charlie steps on a bone. The bone snaps. The pair stop in place. Bruno Houston says,
That can't be good.
Charlie Sargent says,
Hopefully they didn't hear us.
The pair head over to the door. They take up positions on both sides of the door. Bruno Houston says,
This should be interesting.
Charlie Sargent says,
On my mark, we go.
Bruno Houston says,
Understood.
The pair unholster their guns. Charlie Sargent says,
Now we go.
Bruno Houston says,
Understood.
Bruno and Charlie come storming out of the shack. Charlie Sargent says,
Freeze.
Bruno Houston says,
Charlie.
Charlie Sargent says,
Yeah, Bruno.
Bruno Houston says,
I don't think that would work so well against the undead.
42. Charlie Sargent says,
Oh crap, you're right. I did not think this plan through.
Bruno Houston says,
Not necessarily. We still have our guns pointed at the zombies.
Charlie Sargent says,
That's right. We can still kill the undead and save the girl.
Bruno Houston says,
Good point.
Bruno heads over to where Molly was held. Bruno Houston says,
Cover me, I'm going in.
Charlie Sargent says,
I'm on it.
Bruno charges towards Molly's current position. Charlie provides cover fire. Charlie manages to kill several zombies. Bruno Houston says,
I'm here to save you, miss.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Thank God that help has finally arrived.
Bruno proceeds to untie Molly. Molly stands up. Bruno Houston says,
All right, you clear out of here. We'll try to hold them off.
Molly Tweedledee says,
Understood.
Molly attempts to run. She manages to get to the edge of the encampment. Molly Tweedledee says,
What about you two?
43. Bruno Houston says,
We'll catch up with you after we're done here.
Charlie Sargent says,
Exactly.
Molly heads away from the encampment. She doesn't notice that there are 2 zombies following her. Bruno Houston says,
Let's do this.
Bruno and Charlie proceeds to fight the undead. Zombie says,
Stop those 2 humans.
The zombies charge towards Bruno and Charlie. Bruno and Charlie attempt to fight back. Bruno Houston says,
It looks like this is the big one.
Charlie Sargent says,
Yeah, we might not make it out of here.
Bruno Houston says,
Well then, it's been an honor serving alongside you.
Charlie Sargent says,
I would have to say the same about you.
The 2 cops were fighting the undead. Zombie leader says,
Release the zombie wolves.
Zombie hunts master says,
Understood.
The zombie hunts master unleashes the zombie wolves. They head in the direction of Molly Tweedledee. Zombie leader says,
Follow them. Make sure they lead the female back here.
44. Zombie hunts master says,
Understood, sir.
The zombie hunts master follows the zombie wolves. Zombie leader says,
Good. They will lead the female back here.
The zombie leader doesn't notice that there is a hunter in the area. Hunter says,
So, it seems that Grover was right to call me. They are zombies.
The hunter is referring to the events when Sheriff Grover Knowles found the zombie that killed Erica Reed and Bryant Blake. Hunter says,
I've better report back to Sheriff Knowles.
The hunter sneaks away to the meeting place. He doesn't realize that the zombie leader senses him. Zombie leader says,
So, he is still alive.
Zombie says,
Who is, Master?
Zombie leader says,
An old enemy of mine. I haven't sensed him in years.
Cut to exterior campsite. Afternoon. Sheriff Grover Knowles is at the campsite. He is waiting for the hunter. Search party member number 1 says,
He should be here by now.
Search party member number 2 says,
Yeah.
45. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
If I know Claymore Grime Tomb, he'll show up soon enough.
Sheriff Grover Knowles turns to face the rest of the forest. Claymore Grimtomb shows up. Sheriff Grover Knowles sees him. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
About time you showed up.
Claymore Grimtomb says,
Of course.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
Any info about the situation?
Claymore Grimtomb says,
Yes.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
What's the situation?
Claymore Grimtomb says,
It seems that Officer Houston and Officer Sargent are fighting the undead.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
What about Erica Reed? Did you find her?
Claymore Grimtomb says,
Unfortunately, I did not.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
That must mean that Erica Reed has died.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
It looks that way.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
What about Bruno Houston and Charlie Sargent?
Claymore Grimtomb says.
They were fighting the undead.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
They were fighting the undead.
46. Claymore Grimtomb says.
Yes, they had recently saved a female camper.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
That's good.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
There was also something strange about the situation.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
What do you mean?
Claymore Grimtomb says.
There were 2 zombies in particular.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
2 zombies.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
Yes, one was the leader of the group.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Leader of the group.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
Yes, the other is the Hunt's master.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Hunt's master.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
As strange as it sounds, it's very much true.
Search Party Member Number 1 says.
What are we going to do now?
Search Party Member Number 2 says.
He does have a point.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
We wait.
Search Party Member Number 1 says.
What are you talking about?
47. Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
We shall wait until the dust clears. In the meantime, we will form a rescue party.
Search Party Member Number 1 says.
Now I see what you're talking about.
Search Party Member Number 2 says.
What about the 2 cops?
Search Party Member Number 1 says.
She does have a point.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
Their chances of survival are very slim.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
How slim?
Claymore Grimtomb says.
They're goners.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
It's that slim.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
I'm afraid so.
Cut to Interior Encampment. Afternoon. Bruno Houston and Charlie Sargent were fighting the undead. They were being overwhelmed, zombie leader says.
Soon, they will join the legions of the undead.
Bruno is the first to die. Charlie dies soon afterwards, zombie leader says.
Excellent. Now for the female.
Cut to 48. Interior Forest. Afternoon. Molly Tweedledee is running. She is being chased by the zombie wolves. Molly Tweedledee says.
Hopefully, I'll outrun the wolves.
Cut to Interior Forest. Afternoon. Nanook Greenstar and Latasha Sheena Douglas were in the forest. They were on the trail of the zombies. Nanook spots something. Nanook Greenstar says.
We're getting close.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
How close?
Nanook Greenstar says.
Only a couple 100 meters from here.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
That close.
Nanook Greenstar says.
Yes.
Nanook hears something. It is the sound of the zombie wolves. She readies her bow. Nanook Greenstar says.
Get ready. The undead are coming.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Where are they coming from?
Nanook Greenstar says.
From south of our current position.
Latasha Sheena Douglas says.
Are you sure?
Nanook Greenstar says.
Yes.
49. Latasha readies her bow. They don't realize that the zombie Hunt's master has managed to sneak up behind them. Zombie Hunt's master says.
Now's my chance.
The zombie Hunt's master attacks both Nanook and Latasha. He kills both of them. Zombie Hunt's master says.
Well, that was surprisingly easy.
The zombie Hunt's master could see Molly Tweedledee coming into view. She is being chased by the zombies. Zombie Hunt's master says.
Close the trap.
The zombie wolves all surround Molly. Zombie Hunt's master says.
Bring the female in alive.
The zombie wolves close in. The zombie Hunt's master proceeds to use a lasso he had with him. Molly is tied up. Zombie Hunt's master says.
All right, the mission is accomplished. Head back to the encampment.
The zombie Hunt's master and the zombie wolves head back to the encampment. Cut to Exterior Pathway. Afternoon. Huck and the other camp counselors were looking for Alyssa. Wallace Raymond says.
Any word from Nanook and Latasha?
Huck Abberton says.
Not yet.
Huck uses the walkie-talkie. 50. Huck Abberton says.
That's strange. I'm not getting anything.
The zombie Hunt's master picks up the walkie-talkie. Zombie Hunt's master says.
So, you are wondering about the elf and the human.
Huck Abberton says.
Who the hell are you? How did you know that?
Zombie Hunt's master says.
I am the master of the hunt.
Huck Abberton says.
What did you do with them?
Zombie Hunt's master says.
They're dead.
Huck Abberton says.
Damn it. You had something to do with it.
Zombie Hunt's master says.
You are very perceptive.
Huck Abberton says.
I swear to make you pay for what you did to them.
Zombie Hunt's master says.
Come fight me if you wish.
The zombie Hunt's master crushes the walkie-talkie. Huck Abberton says.
Damn it.
Wallace Raymond says.
What was that all about?
Huck Abberton says.
It seems that Nanarok and Latasha are dead.
Gavri Azarov says.
Are you serious?
51. Huck Abberton says.
I'm afraid so.
Wallace Raymond says.
This is a sad day, indeed.
Ruparil hears something. Ruparil Jatalka says.
Hey guys, I hear something.
Wallace Raymond says.
What is it?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
It seems that there is a zombie nearby.
Wallace Raymond says.
Are you certain?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
Yes.
Cagner and Gavri move into position. Wallace Raymond says.
Where is this zombie?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
It's over that way.
Ruparil points in the direction that she heard the zombie. Wallace Raymond says.
Where are they?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
They're closing in.
They hear a person scream. The person is Nehika Windclaw. Nehika comes running. Nehika Windclaw says.
Somebody help.
Cagner and Gavri approach her. Gavri notices that she is wounded. Gavri Azarov says.
This isn't good.
52. Gavri turns to Ruparil. Gavri Azarov says.
Hey, Ruparil.
Ruparil Jatalka says.
What is it?
Gavri Azarov says.
We have another victim of the undead.
Ruparil approaches Nehika. She sees the wounds. Ruparil Jatalka says.
This is serious.
Nehika Windclaw says.
I'm not the only one injured.
Ruparil Jatalka says.
What are you talking about?
Nehika Windclaw says.
Cedric is badly wounded.
Nehika points to Cedric's location. Nehika Windclaw says.
He's over there.
Huck Abberton says.
I'll help him.
Huck goes over to Cedric's location. He sees Cedric. Huck Abberton says.
Oh my god.
Ruparil Jatalka says.
What's wrong?
Huck Abberton says.
Cedric's dead.
Wallace Raymond says.
I can't believe this.
Gavri Azarov says.
That must mean that there are approximately 9 deaths.
53. Huck Abberton says.
Exactly. We've better do something about this.
Nehika falls to the ground. She lies limp on the ground. Ruparil Jatalka says.
Oh my god.
Ruparil checks Nehika's pulse. She finds that Nehika has died. Ruparil Jatalka says.
Guys, I have bad news.
Huck Abberton says.
What are you talking vertical bar about?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
Nehika has died.
Gavri Azarov says.
That makes it 10 people whom died.
Huck Abberton says.
It just keeps getting worse and worse.
Ruparil gets a call from Julio. Ruparil Jatalka says.
What is it?
Julio Alvarado says.
I just found Orville Kane. He had just died.
Ruparil Jatalka says.
Oh my god.
Huck Abberton says.
What is it?
Ruparil Jatalka says.
Julio says that Orville Kane has just died.
54. Huck Abberton says.
Well, that's just great. That's another dead camper on our hands.
Gavri Azarov says.
I would have to agree.
Huck Abberton says.
And we're still not closer to finding where Molly is located.
Gavri Azarov says.
Although we do have a good idea where she is.
Huck Abberton says.
Good point.
The camp counselors continue the search for Alyssa Sanford. Cut to exterior lakeside. Afternoon. Lirahan is at the lake. Lirahan Whitelight says.
I'm surprised that Karoshi and Brimax aren't back yet.
Lirahan hears something. It is the sound of Karoshi Ragaran. Karoshi comes out of the water. Lirahan Whitelight says.
There you are.
Lirahan notices something strange. Lirahan Whitelight says.
Karoshi, what's wrong?
Karoshi Ragaran says. Karoshi lunges at Liran. Lirahan barely manages to duck out of the way. Lirahan Whitelight says.
Oh my god. What happened to you, Karoshi?
55. Karoshi Ragaran says.
Ra.
Lirahan realizes what's going on. Lirahan Whitelight says.
Oh my god. You're a zombie.
Luke David Copeland says.
You got that right.
Lirahan turns to face Luke. Lirahan Whitelight says.
Thank God you're here.
Karoshi turns to face Luke. Luke was holding a baseball bat. Luke David Copeland says.
You want a piece of me.
Luke readies his baseball bat. Luke David Copeland says.
Bring it on.
Karoshi lunges at Luke. Luke swings the baseball bat. Luke knocks the zombified Karosh's head off. Luke David Copeland says.
Well then, that was easy.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
Of course.
Lirahan leans in to kiss Luke. Lirahan Whitelight says.
Thanks for the help.
Luke David Copeland says.
You're welcome.
Luke looks around the immediate surroundings. Luke David Copeland says.
Let's get out of here.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
Good idea.
56. Lirahan and Luke rush out of the area. They see a nearby bush. There is something rustling in it. Luke David Copeland says.
All right, whoever you are, come out of there.
The sounds of moaning could be heard. Learhan Whitelight says,
That can't be good.
Luke David Copeland says,
I would have to agree.
The pair look over at the bush. Luke David Copeland says,
All right, whoever you are, you got to the count of 5 to come out of there.
Luke starts counting to 5. Bremax comes out of the bush. Learhan Whitelight says,
Oh my god. Bremax, you're a zombie.
Luke David Copeland says,
I'm afraid there's nothing we can do for him.
Bremax lunges at Learhan and Luke. They manage to duck out of the way. Bremax Bonesteel says,
Ruh?
Bremax turns to face Luke. Luke David Copeland says,
It's a shame I have to do this.
Luke wins up for the strike. Bremax Bonesteel says,
Ruh?
Bremax charges at Luke. Luke dodges the attack. Luke David Copeland says,
That was close.
57. Bremax turns around. He makes another charge. Luke manages to avoid the attack. Luke readies his baseball bat. Luke David Copeland says,
Here it comes.
Bremax charges at Luke. Luke swings the baseball bat. Bremax was hit. He was knocked to the ground. Learhan Whitelight says,
Now's your chance.
Luke David Copeland says,
I was thinking the same thing.
Luke swings his baseball bat. Luke kills the zombified Bremax. Luke David Copeland says,
That was easy.
Learhan Whitelight says,
Yeah, that was surprisingly easy.
Luke David Copeland says,
Let's get a move on.
Learhan Whitelight says,
Good idea.
Learhan and Luke head over to the camp counselor's office. Cut to interior camp counselor's office. Afternoon. Julio and Nez are there. Nez Darkburner says,
This is starting to get serious.
Julio Alvarado says,
Yeah, several campers have already died.
Nez Darkburner says,
Not only that, but several camp counselors as well.
Learhan and Luke enter the camp counselor's office. Julio sees them. 58. Julio Alvarado says,
I see that you two made it here safely.
Luke David Copeland says,
Of course.
Julio Alvarado says,
That's good to hear.
Nez sees Learhan. Nez Darkburner says,
I see that you managed to rescue Learhan.
Luke David Copeland says,
Yes.
Nez Darkburner says,
Good for you.
Learhan starts blushing. Nez notices her. Nez Darkburner says,
You have feelings for him, don't you?
Learhan Whitelight says,
How did you know?
Nez Darkburner says,
I suspected as much. Besides, I remember when I was younger, I had my own history.
Learhan Whitelight says,
What are you talking about?
Nez Darkburner says,
Years ago, I used to have a girlfriend.
Learhan Whitelight says,
When was that?
Nez Darkburner says,
It was during the early 1990s.
Learhan Whitelight says,
That is rather interesting.
59. Luke David Copeland says,
What are we going to do now?
Nez Darkburner says,
Well, we should try to find any of the other campers whom survived.
Julio Alvarado says,
Yes, bring them back here.
Nez Darkburner says,
We're almost done the preparation of the defenses.
Learhan Whitelight says,
That is good to hear.
Luke David Copeland says,
Yeah.
Luke realizes something. Luke David Copeland says,
Where should we start the search?
Nez Darkburner says,
There's a couple of people holding out at the power generator.
Luke David Copeland says,
The power generator.
Nez Darkburner says,
Yes.
Luke David Copeland says,
We'll be back as soon as possible.
Nez Darkburner says,
That's good to hear.
Julio Alvarado says,
There's not too many campers left, or camp counselors for that matter.
Nez Darkburner says,
Do you mind?
Julio Alvarado says,
Sorry about that.
60. Nez Darkburner says,
Anyways, the longer we wait, the greater the chance that the people will die.
Luke David Copeland says,
Good point.
Nez hands Learhan a bow and a quiver of arrows. Nez Darkburner says,
You're going to need this.
Learhan Whitelight says,
Thanks.
Learhan and Luke head over to the power generator. Nez Darkburner says,
I sure hope those two can make it back alive.
Julio Alvarado says,
I'm sure they can do this.
Nez and Julio are adding to the reinforcements of the defenses. Cut to interior power generator building. Afternoon. Juliet and Dwayne are inside the power generator room. Juliet Michael says,
I sure hope help can arrive.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Of course help will come.
Juliet Michael says,
It's only a matter of time before the zombies get in here.
Juliet hears the sound of the zombies trying to get into the building. Juliet Michael says,
Oh shit, I can hear them getting in.
61. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Don't worry, the barricades will hold out.
Cut to exterior pathway. Afternoon. Learhan and Luke are rushing on their way to the power generator building. Learhan Whitelight says,
I hope we can get to the power generator building in time.
Luke David Copeland says,
I'm sure we can make it.
The pair had made it closer to the power generator building. Luke sees that there are several zombies surrounding the power generator building. Luke David Copeland says,
"This should be interesting."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"You think this is interesting?"
Luke David Copeland says,
"Of course."
Luke goes closer to the power generator building. Luke David Copeland says,
"Is anyone in there?"
Juliet Michael says,
"Finally, help has arrived."
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"I knew help will come."
The zombies are alerted to Luke and Lirahan's presence. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Good going. They've spotted us."
Luke David Copeland says,
"I have an idea."
62. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I sure hope you know what you're doing."
Luke David Copeland says,
"Trust me on this one."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I have a bad feeling about this."
Luke starts luring the zombies away from the power generator building. Juliet Michael says,
"What on earth are they doing?"
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"I have a feeling Luke is trying to draw them away from here."
Juliet Michael says,
"Are you sure about that?"
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"I'm sure of it."
Lirahan manages to kill several of the zombies. She turns to the power generator building. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Now's your chance."
Juliet Michael says,
"Finally."
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"Let's get out of here."
Juliet Michael says,
"It should be pretty obvious what the idea is."
Juliet and Dwayne immediately rush out of the power generator building. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"Thanks for the help."
Juliet Michael says,
"Let's get out of here."
63. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"Good idea."
Dwayne realizes something. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"What about Luke?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"We should wait for him."
Juliet Michael says,
"Are you crazy?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"You guys head to the camp counselor's office."
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"What about you?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I'll follow behind you."
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"Understood."
Dwayne and Juliet head over to the camp counselor's office. Lirahan waits for Luke. She looks in the direction that he went. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I hope you make it back alive."
Lirahan begins on her way to the camp counselor's office. She hears something. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"What in the ancient worlds?"
She turns to see Luke running. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"What in the world is going on?"
Luke David Copeland says,
"It makes a lot of sense in context."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I have a feeling you have a good explanation for this."
64. Luke David Copeland says,
"Yes, I do. But for now, let's keep running."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Good idea."
Lirahan notices a small group of zombies chasing him. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"You just had to attract a group of zombies, didn't you?"
Luke David Copeland says,
"It didn't start out that way."
Lirahan and Luke manage to get within range of the camp counselor's office. Nez Darkburner sees them. Nez Darkburner says,
"What in the ancient worlds?"
Dwayne sees them. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"Finally, they're here."
Juliet Michael says,
"Quick, let them in."
Nez Darkburner says,
"I was about to do that."
Nez opens the door. Luke and Lirahan manage to get inside. The zombies start crowding around the door. They start pushing the door. Juliet Michael says,
"I'll help."
Nez and Juliet try closing the door. Unfortunately, one of the zombies grabs Juliet. The zombie drags her out of the office. Juliet Michael says,
"AIEE. Somebody help."
The zombies all crowd around Juliet. They start eating her. She dies from the wounds. Julio comes in from another part of the office. 65. Julio Alvarado says,
"What's going on?"
Nez Darkburner says,
Luke and Lirahan made it back. Juliet's been killed by the zombies.
Julio takes out a machete. He storms out of the office. Julio Alvarado says,
"Hey, you zombie bastards.
The zombies turn to face Julio. Julio Alvarado says,
Let's bring it on."
The zombies charge towards Julio. Julio starts swinging the machete. He starts killing the zombies. Nez Darkburner says,
"Kick their zombie asses, Julio."
Julio slaughters the zombies. Nez Darkburner says,
"That was easy."
Julio Alvarado says,
"Now for the hard part."
Nez Darkburner says,
"What are you talking about?"
Julio Alvarado says,
"It's having to ensure Juliet doesn't come back as an undead."
Nez Darkburner says,
"I see your point. It's unfortunate that this had to happen."
Julio Alvarado says,
"Unfortunately, that is true."
Julio uses the machete on Juliet. He severs her head. Julio Alvarado says,
"That's the end of that."
Julio heads back to the camp counselor's office. 66. Cut to exterior pathway. Afternoon. Huck Abberton and the other camp counselors were searching for Alyssa. Wallace Raymond says,
"She doesn't seem to be here."
Huck Abberton says,
"Good point. But we should still try searching for her anyway."
Rupariel hears something. It is a zombie. Ruparil Jatalka says.
There's a zombie nearby, I just know it.
A zombie starts charging out of the bushes. The zombie lunges at Ruparil. The zombie kills Ruparil. Ruparil Jatalka says. The other camp counselors are alerted to the presence of the zombie. Kagner Gashnak says.
So, we lost another one of our comrades.
Kagner lunges at the zombie. Kagner rips the zombie's head off. Wallace Raymond says.
That was unexpected.
Gavri Azarov says.
I would have to agree.
Huck Abberton says.
Anyways, that's one less zombie we have to deal with.
Gavri Azarov says.
Good point.
Kagner joins up with the rest of the team. 67. Wallace Raymond says.
I'm surprised that you were able to do that.
Kagner Gashnak says.
True. I have trained to do these kinds of things.
Wallace Raymond says.
Are you serious?
Kagner Gashnak says.
Yes. Us orcs are natural warriors.
Huck Abberton says.
Do you two mind?
Wallace Raymond says.
Oh right, we still have campers to find.
Huck Abberton says.
Exactly.
Wallace Raymond says.
What should we do now?
Huck Abberton says.
We split into 2 teams.
Wallace Raymond says.
Are you sure it's a good idea?
Gavri Azarov says.
Yeah, I would have to agree with Wallace on this one.
Huck Abberton says.
While that may sound like a bad idea, but we would cover ground this way.
Wallace Raymond says.
If you say so.
Huck Abberton says.
All right, Wallace, you're with me.
Wallace Raymond says.
Understood.
68. Huck Abberton says.
Gavri, you're with Kagner.
Wallace Raymond says.
This should be interesting.
Kagner Gashnak says.
Of course.
Huck Abberton says.
Now that it's settled, Wallace and I will take the east path.
Wallace Raymond says.
Understood.
Huck Abberton says.
Kagner and Gavri will take the north route.
Gavri Azarov says.
Understood.
Huck and Wallace head down the east path. Kagner and Gavri head down the north path. Cut 2. Interior Camp Counselor's office. Afternoon. Julio entered the office. Nez Darkburner says.
That was easy.
Luke David Copeland says.
I'm surprised that you were able to defeat all those zombies.
Julio Alvarado says.
Of course.
Julio places the machete back in the back room. Nez Darkburner says.
What are we going to do now?
Julio Alvarado says.
To be honest, I'm not exactly sure.
Luke David Copeland says.
That can't be good.
69. Lirahan Whitelight says.
We should try to set up defenses.
Julio Alvarado says.
That's a good idea.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
What about the other campers?
Julio Alvarado says.
That's right.
Nez Darkburner says.
We should send someone to get in touch with Huck.
Julio Alvarado says.
Good idea.
Nez Darkburner says.
I'll be the one to go.
Julio Alvarado says.
Are you sure about this?
Nez Darkburner says.
Of course.
Nez goes over to the door. Julio Alvarado says.
Good luck on your mission.
Nez Darkburner says.
Thank you.
Nez exits the office. Luke David Copeland says.
Are you sure it's a good idea to let Nez go out there alone?
Julio Alvarado says.
I'm sure that he'll make it back alive. Besides, he used to be part of the Kralax horde.
Luke David Copeland says.
Kralax horde.
70. Julio Alvarado says.
Yes, it's a long story. It's comprised of orcs and goblins.
Luke David Copeland says.
Orcs and goblins.
Julio Alvarado says.
Yes, years ago, they settled on lands next to the border of the United Republic of States.
Lirahan Whitelight says.
I remember that.
Nez enters the office. Nez Darkburner says.
I just forgot something.
Nez picks up a baseball bat. Luke David Copeland says.
Good luck on your mission.
Nez Darkburner says.
Thank you.
Julio hands Nez a walkie-talkie. Julio Alvarado says.
Have this, just in case.
Nez Darkburner says.
Good idea.
Nez leaves the office. Cut 2. Exterior north path. Afternoon. Kagner and Gavri are traveling along the path. Kagner Gashnak says.
I'm surprised that we made it this far without encountering another zombie.
Gavri Azarov says.
I would have to agree.
71. Kagner hears something. Kagner Gashnak says.
I have a bad feeling we found a zombie.
Gavri Azarov says.
I see your point.
Kagner and Gavri look over to the nearby wooded area. Gavri Azarov says.
Are you able to see anything?
Kagner Gashnak says.
I don't see any zombies yet.
Gavri hears the sounds of moaning zombies. Gavri Azarov says.
There's more zombies here than we imagined.
Gavri and Kagner look around the area. Kagner notices something. Kagner Gashnak says.
Here they come.
The zombies start charging towards the pair. Kagner Gashnak says.
You shall not stop us.
Kagner swings his axe. Gavri Azarov says.
Where in the ancient worlds did you get the axe?
Kagner Gashnak says.
I had gotten it at the tool shed.
Gavri Azarov says.
All right, I forgot about that part.
The pair are fighting the zombies. Gavri was bitten by one of the zombies. Gavri Azarov says. 72. Kagner Gashnak says.
Oh shit, you're hurt.
Gavri Azarov says.
I'll be alright.
Kagner Gashnak says.
I doubt it. From the looks of your wounds, your chances of survival are slim.
Gavri Azarov says.
I just have to survive long enough to complete this mission.
Kagner Gashnak says.
You're bleeding heavily.
Gavri Azarov says.
Now's not the time for bleeding.
Gavri punches a zombie's head off. Gavri Azarov says.
As I said before, I have to survive long enough to complete the mission.
Gavri thinks of something. Gavri Azarov says.
I have an idea. Follow my lead.
Kagner Gashnak says.
What the hell are you talking about?
Gavri Azarov says.
Trust me on this one.
Kagner Gashnak says.
Sure, I have a bad feeling about this.
Gavri starts leading the zombies to the east path. The path leads to Gavri's home. Cut to 73. Exterior east path. Late afternoon. Huck and Wallace are making their way down the east path. They hear something. Wallace Raymond says.
That can't be good.
Huck Abberton says.
Yeah. That sounds like zombies.
Wallace Raymond says.
We've better be on our guard.
Huck Abberton says.
Good point.
The pair ready themselves. Cut to exterior pathway. Late afternoon. Nez Darkburner is making his way down the path. Nez Darkburner says.
This is rather interesting.
Nez hears something. Nez Darkburner says.
It's obviously zombies.
Nez readies his knife. He notices the zombies getting closer. Nez Darkburner says.
Alright, you zombies, bring it on.
The zombies charge at Nez. Nez starts fighting off the zombies. Nez Darkburner says.
This is great. I'm going to win.
One of the zombies bites Nez. Nez Darkburner says.
Awk.
The zombies immediately swarm Nez. He soon dies as a result. 74. Cut to exterior east path. Late afternoon. Huck and Wallace were making their way down the path. Wallace Raymond says.
It looks like we're making major progress on our quest.
Huck Abberton says.
Yeah.
Huck notices something. It is the zombified Alyssa Sanford. Huck Abberton says.
It looks like we found her.
Wallace Raymond says.
That is great.
They don't notice that there is a pair of zombies creeping up behind them. They jump on Wallace. They start biting him. Wallace Raymond says.
Awk.
Huck turns around. Huck Abberton says.
Oh crap.
Huck rushes over to help Wallace. He doesn't notice that a zombie is creeping up on him. Alyssa Sanford says.
I have to do something.
She immediately charges at the zombie. She kills the zombie. Huck manages to fend off the two zombies. He notices that Wallace is badly hurt. Huck Abberton says.
Oh crap. You're hurt.
Huck tries to heal Wallace's wounds. Huck Abberton says.
You're going to be all right.
Wallace Raymond says.
It's too late for me.
75. Alyssa Sanford says.
He's right.
Huck turns to face Alyssa. Huck Abberton says.
What the hell is going on?
Alyssa Sanford says.
You're wondering how I'm able to talk.
Huck Abberton says.
Well, there's that.
Alyssa Sanford says.
There's also the part about how I'm able to function, despite being a zombie.
Huck Abberton says.
That's another thing I was wondering.
Alyssa Sanford says.
To be honest, I haven't the slightest on either part.
Huck Abberton says.
It could be worse.
Alyssa Sanford says.
You had to say that.
Huck Abberton says.
Why is that?
Alyssa Sanford says.
You'll soon see.
Alyssa points to Wallace. Wallace had died and rose up as a zombie. Huck Abberton says.
Oh shit. I'm starting to see your point.
Wallace lunges at Huck. Huck manages to duck out of the way. He grabs the hatchet. He swings it at Wallace. The hatchet hits Wallace in the head, killing him. 76. Huck Abberton says.
That was easy.
Alyssa Sanford says.
You forgot about the other two zombies.
Huck Abberton says.
Oh right.
Huck kills the two zombies. Huck Abberton says.
That was easy.
Alyssa Sanford says.
Yes.
Huck Abberton says.
Now that that's settled, there's just one more thing left to do.
Alyssa Sanford says.
It involves me, doesn't it?
Huck Abberton says.
Yes. This is a tricky matter.
Alyssa Sanford says.
I've better stay out of sight.
Huck Abberton says.
Good idea. Given that you're now a zombie, they're going to hunt you down.
Alyssa leaves the area. Huck gets a call on his cell phone. Huck Abberton says.
Hello.
Julio Alvarado says.
It's me, Julio.
Huck Abberton says.
What's the situation?
Julio Alvarado says.
Have you heard back from Nez?
Huck Abberton says.
Not yet.
77. Julio Alvarado says.
He said that he was headed down the east path.
Huck Abberton says.
That's the same path that I'm on.
Julio Alvarado says.
Did you find Alyssa yet?
Huck Abberton says.
Yes.
Julio Alvarado says.
That's good to hear.
Huck Abberton says.
Yes. There's a strange turn of events in the search.
Julio Alvarado says.
What are you talking about?
Huck Abberton says.
I found her. By the time I found her, she had turned into a zombie.
Julio Alvarado says.
Did she try to eat your brain?
Huck Abberton says.
That's the strange part. Wallace and I were jumped by 2 zombies. Alyssa had arrived to help us.
Julio Alvarado says.
She's dead, right?
Huck Abberton says.
Very much so. That didn't stop her from helping us.
Julio Alvarado says.
That's good to hear. What about Wallace?
Huck Abberton says.
He's dead.
Julio Alvarado says.
This day is getting worse.
78. Huck Abberton says.
This is unfortunate.
Julio Alvarado says.
Too true. What shall we do now?
Huck Abberton says.
I'll check for Nez. After that, I'll catch up with Cagner and Gavry.
Julio Alvarado says.
Understood. We'll keep the defenses up here.
Huck Abberton says.
Understood.
Huck heads on his way to Nez's location. Cut 2. Exterior Gavry's house. Late afternoon, Cagner and Gavry made it to Gavry's house. Gavry Azarov says.
Finally, we're here.
Cagner Gashnak says.
What in the ancient worlds do you have planned?
Gavry Azarov says.
You'll soon see.
Gavry sees the zombies getting closer. Gavry Azarov says.
Hold position. I'll lead them away.
Cagner Gashnak says.
Understood. I hope you know what you're doing.
Gavry Azarov says.
Of course.
Gavry leads the zombies towards the house. Cagner Gashnak says.
I have a bad feeling about this.
79. Exterior Gavry's house. Late afternoon, Gavry enters his house. The zombies are closing in on him. Gavry Azarov says.
Just a few more seconds.
He heads down the hallway. He sees a gun locker. Gavry Azarov says.
So, I found it.
Gavry heads into the next room. He gets the key for the gun locker. He opens the gun locker. Gavry Azarov says.
There it is.
Gavry grabs a gun and a clip of ammo. He fires into the zombies. Gavry Azarov says.
Die, you undead bastards.
He shoots several zombies. He empties the clip. Gavry Azarov says.
Oh shit.
He notices a grenade in the locker. He grabs it. Gavry Azarov says.
If I'm going to die, I'm going down fighting.
He charges at the zombies. The zombies swarm him. Gavry pulls the ring on the grenade. Cut 2. Exterior Gavry's house. Late afternoon. SFX. The grenade explodes. Cagner sees the explosion. Cagner Gashnak says.
Oh shit, Gavry.
Cagner rushes into the house. He sees the remains of the zombies and Gavry. 80. Cagner Gashnak says.
This is just great.
Cagner walks over to Gavry's body. Cagner Gashnak says.
So, this was your plan all along.
He sees that the zombies were destroyed by the exploding grenade. Cagner Gashnak says.
At least you died fighting, Gavry.
He notices a ceremonial saber on the mantel above the fireplace. Cagner Gashnak says.
This is rather interesting.
He approaches the fireplace. Cagner Gashnak says.
I hope you don't mind me borrowing this.
Cagner picks up the ceremonial saber. He exits the house. Cut 2. Exterior East Pathway. Late afternoon. Huck is heading down the east path. He soon arrives at the location of Nez Darkburner. He sees Nez's remains, and the remains of the zombies. Huck Abberton says.
Oh my god.
Huck calls Julio. He informs Julio about the situation. Julio Alvarado says.
Thanks for the info.
Huck Abberton says.
Well, I've better make sure Nez doesn't come back as a zombie.
Julio Alvarado says.
Good idea.
Huck uses the hatchet on Nez. He splits Nez's skull open. 81. Huck Abberton says.
Well, it's done. Rest in peace, Nez.
Huck heads towards the north path. Cut 2. Exterior North Pathway. Late afternoon. Cagner is making his way down the path. He was slaughtering zombies along the way. Cagner Gashnak says.
I can't believe how many of the campers have died so far.
Cagner sees several zombies charge at him. He readies his axe. Cagner Gashnak says.
So, today is a good day to die.
Cagner runs at full speed. He starts chopping up the zombies. Several other zombies descend upon his position. They swarm him. Cagner takes out the ceremonial saber. He dual wields the axe and the saber. Cagner Gashnak says.
For the glory of the clans.
Cagner fights the zombies. Huck arrives at the position. Huck Abberton says.
Oh shit. Cagner's in trouble.
Huck rushes over to Cagner. He sees the zombies kill Cagner. Huck Abberton says,
"Oh shit. I've got to get out of here."
Huck starts running. The zombies start chasing him. Cut to interior camp counselor's office. Late afternoon. Julio, Luke, Lirahan, and Dwayne are at the office. Julio gets a call from Huck. 82. Julio Alvarado says,
"What's the situation?"
Huck Abberton says,
"Cagner's now dead. I have a bad feeling Gavry's also dead."
Julio Alvarado says,
"This is bad."
Huck Abberton says,
"Anyways, be prepared."
Julio Alvarado says,
"Why's that?"
Huck Abberton says,
"A huge swarm of zombies are currently chasing me."
Julio Alvarado says,
"This can't be good."
Huck Abberton says,
"Exactly."
Huck is making his way to the camp counselor's office. Julio turns to Luke, Lirahan, and Dwayne. Luke David Copeland says,
"What's the situation?"
Julio Alvarado says,
"Huck's on his way here."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"That's good."
Julio Alvarado says,
"He's being chased by a swarm of zombies."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"That's bad."
Luke David Copeland says,
"We've better do something about this."
Julio Alvarado says,
"Exactly."
83. Luke David Copeland says,
"What are we going to do?"
Julio Alvarado says,
"We get more arrows."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I'll go get it."
Julio Alvarado says,
"I'll go get them. You guys wait here."
Julio gets the machete. He goes to the door. He turns to the trio. Julio Alvarado says,
"You guys wait here. When Huck arrives here, let him in."
Luke David Copeland says,
"Understood."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Understood."
Julio leaves the office. Lirahan goes over to the window. Luke David Copeland says,
"What are we going to do now?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
Julio did say to stay here.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"I hope he makes it back alive."
Luke David Copeland says,
"I'm sure of it."
Lirahan notices something in the distance. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Hey guys."
Luke David Copeland says,
"What is it?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"I see something in the distance."
84. Luke David Copeland says,
"What the hell are you talking about?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"It's Huck and the zombies."
Luke David Copeland says,
"You're right."
Lirahan gets the bow and arrows. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"When Huck gets here, you guys open the door."
Luke David Copeland says,
"Understood."
Dwayne opens the window. Lirahan takes up position. She takes out an arrow. She pulls back the bowstring. She starts firing at the zombies. Huck Abberton says,
"Oh shit, they're getting closer."
Huck was running as fast as possible. He gets to the door. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Open the door, now."
Luke David Copeland says,
"I'm on it."
Luke opens the door. Huck rushes into the office. Luke and Dwayne close the door. Luke holds the door shut, while Dwayne locks the door. Huck Abberton says,
"That was close."
Luke David Copeland says,
"It's fortunate that you made it back alive."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"Just a few more zombies."
Lirahan kills the remaining zombies. She closes the window. Lirahan Whitelight says,
"That was close."
85. Huck notices that Julio is gone. Huck Abberton says,
"Where's Julio?"
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"He went to the archery range to get more arrows."
Huck Abberton says,
"This should be interesting."
Luke David Copeland says,
"Hopefully he'll make it back alive."
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
"What are we going to do now?"
Huck Abberton says,
"We will try to wait out the zombie swarm."
Lirahan Whitelight says,
"What about Molly Tweedledee?"
Huck Abberton says,
"We haven't found her yet."
Huck gets a call. It is from Sheriff Grover Knowles. Huck Abberton says,
"Who's this?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"This is Sheriff Grover Knowles."
Huck Abberton says,
"What can I do for you?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"I hear that you are missing one of your campers."
Huck Abberton says,
"Yes. Molly Tweedledee went missing earlier today."
86. Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"I have info on her current whereabouts."
Huck Abberton says,
"Where is she?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"Molly is being held in an encampment in the center of the forest."
Huck Abberton says,
"That's good to hear. How's she doing?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"She's still alive, for the time being."
Huck Abberton says,
"That's good to hear."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"Claymore Grimetomb is on his way to save her."
Huck Abberton says,
"That's good to hear."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"What's the status on your end?"
Huck Abberton says,
"We suffered heavy losses. There's about 5 of us here at the camp."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"This is serious."
87. Huck Abberton says,
"Yes. Anyways, who's this Claymore Grimetomb?"
Sheriff Grover Knowles says,
"He is an expert hunter."
Huck Abberton says,
"He hunts zombies."
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Yes. He specializes in slaying zombies.
Huck Abberton says.
Are you sure he can do this?
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Of course, he's the best there is in his field of work.
Huck Abberton says.
I just hope you're right about this.
The pair end the phone call. Huck turns to Luke, Learahan, and Dwayne. Luke David Copeland says.
What's the situation?
Learahan Whitelight says.
Yeah, who was that?
Huck Abberton says.
That was Sheriff Grover Knowles of the Astrakhan Police Department.
Learahan Whitelight says.
What did he have to say?
Huck Abberton says.
They found Molly.
88. Learahan Whitelight says.
That's good to hear.
Huck Abberton says.
They've gotten in touch with a hunter by the name of Claymore Grimetomb.
Learahan Whitelight says.
That is interesting.
Luke David Copeland says.
Yeah, we'll soon win this battle.
Huck Abberton says.
It's just a matter of time before they come back with her.
Learahan Whitelight says.
I hope they succeed in their mission.
Luke David Copeland says.
I'm sure of it.
Cut to exterior campsite. Late afternoon. Sheriff Grover Knowles had completed the call. Search party member number 1 says.
What are we going to do now?
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
As I said before, we form a rescue party.
Search party member number 1 says.
That's right.
Search party member number 2 says.
I'll join the rescue party.
Search party member number 1 says.
Good idea. I'll join too.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
That's good to hear.
89. Claymore Grimetomb says.
Now that it's settled, let's get down to business.
The 4 wait for nightfall. Cut to exterior campsite. Night. It is now nighttime. The 4 members of the rescue party are at the campsite. Claymore Grimetomb says.
Now that it's nighttime, let's put the plan into motion.
Search party member number 1 says.
Understood.
The 4 members of the rescue party head to the zombie encampment. Cut to interior camp counselor's office. Night. Julio had arrived at the office. He sees Huck. Julio Alvarado says.
You made it back in one piece.
Huck Abberton says.
Of course.
Julio notices something. Huck Abberton says.
What is it?
Julio Alvarado says.
It's starting.
Huck Abberton says.
What are you talking about?
Julio Alvarado says.
The undead are descending upon this place.
Huck Abberton says.
They're coming here.
90. Julio Alvarado says.
Exactly.
The 5 people approach the window. They see a couple of zombies approach the office. Cut to exterior encampment. Night. The rescue party arrive at the encampment. Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
We're here.
Claymore Grimetomb says.
Yes.
The zombie leader approaches the rescue party. Zombie leader says.
So, we meet at last?
Claymore Grimetomb says.
Yes. Leave him to me. You guys get Molly out of here.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Understood.
The rescue party go over to Molly's location. They help free her. Molly Tweedledee says.
Thank you.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
Let's get out of here.
Molly Tweedledee says.
Good idea.
Sheriff Grover Knowles says.
I'll cover you guys.
Molly Tweedledee says.
Understood.
Search party member number 1 says.
Understood.
91. Search party member number 2 says.
Understood.
The 3 people leave the area. Sheriff Grover Knowles takes up the rear position. Zombie leader says.
Follow them.
Zombie huntsmaster says.
Understood.
Zombie leader says.
Don't let anyone survive.
Zombie huntsmaster says.
Understood.
The zombie huntsmaster starts following the rescue party. Zombie leader says.
So, this is the epic showdown.
Claymore Grimetomb says.
Yes, you shall be stopped. My brother will be avenged.
Montage. Various. AEXT. Forest. Night. The rescue party are running through the forest. Int. Camp counselor's office. Night. The team are defending against the undead. CEXT. Encampment. Night. The zombie leader and Claymore Grimetomb are fighting. DEXT. Forest. Night. The zombie hunts master catches up with the rescue party. Int. Camp counselor's office. Night. The team manages to whittle down the number of zombies to a manageable level. FEXT. Forest. Night. The rescue party are killed by the zombie hunts master. Molly manages to run away in the chaos. End of montage. Exterior encampment. Night. 92. Claymore Grimetomb and the zombie leader were fighting. Claymore wins the fight. The zombie leader dies. Claymore Grimetomb says.
Now my brother is avenged. It's time to help the rescue party.
Claymore heads to the location if the rescue party. Cut to interior camp counselor's office. Night. The team was fighting the undead. Luke David Copeland says,
It looks like we're going to win.
Lirahan Whitelight says,
You're right.
Julio hears a sound at the back door of the office. Julio Alvarado says,
That's strange.
Huck Abberton says,
What's up?
Julio Alvarado says,
There seems to be someone at the back door.
Huck Abberton says,
I have a bad feeling that it's a zombie.
Julio Alvarado says,
It might not be. There's only one way to find out.
Julio goes to the back door of the office. Julio Alvarado says,
You guys hold the fort.
Huck Abberton says,
Understood?
Julio arrives at the back door. 93. Julio Alvarado says,
Who's there?
Molly Tweedleby says,
It's me, Molly.
Julio Alvarado says,
Good, you're here.
Julio opens the door. He notices a zombie slowly approach the door. Julio Alvarado says,
Quick, get inside.
Molly rushes inside. The zombie lunges at Julio. Julio quickly kills the zombie. He enters the office. He closes and barricades the door behind him. Julio Alvarado says,
That was close.
Molly Tweedleby says,
Yeah.
The pair head to the front room. Luke notices the pair. Luke David Copeland says,
Hey Dwayne.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
What is it?
Luke David Copeland says,
Molly made it back alive.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
That's good to hear.
Luke David Copeland says,
Aren't you going to welcome her back?
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
You do have a point.
Lirahan Whitelight says,
You two do realize that we're currently fighting a bunch of undead.
94. Luke David Copeland says,
Good point.
Cut to exterior forest. Night. Claymore encounters the zombie wolves. Claymore Grimtomb says,
This is rather interesting.
Claymore readies his rifle. The zombie wolves start their attack. Claymore Grimtomb says,
You shall not stop me.
Claymore doesn't notice that the zombie hunt's master was sneaking up behind him. Zombie hunt's master says,
Brother, we meet at last.
Claymore turns to face the zombie hunt's master. Claymore Grimtomb says,
By the ancient worlds. Griffin, is that you?
Zombie hunt's master says,
Yes.
Claymore Grimtomb says,
What have they done to you?
Zombie hunt's master says,
I died in battle. I had found myself brought back as a undead.
The zombie wolves attack Claymore. The zombie hunt's master steps in to take the attack. Claymore manages to kill the zombie wolves. Claymore then turns to the zombie hunt's master. Claymore Grimtomb says,
Don't die on me.
Zombie hunt's master says,
It's already too late for me.
The zombie hunt's master dies from his wounds. 95. Claymore Grimtomb says,
Well, now to find the rescue party.
Sheriff Grover Knowles and the two search party members show up. Claymore sees that they are now undead. Claymore Grimtomb says,
By the ancient worlds.
Claymore quickly kills the three zombies. Claymore Grimtomb says,
Now to help Molly.
Claymore heads in the direction that Molly went. Cut to interior camp counselor's office. Night. The team is defending against the undead. Luke David Copeland says,
It looks like we're going to win.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Not as quickly as you think.
Luke David Copeland says,
What the hell are you talking about?
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
It looks like the undead are making their final move.
Luke David Copeland says,
I'm starting to see your point.
Luke sees a crowd of zombies descending upon the office. Luke David Copeland says,
Hopefully, we can win.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
Hopefully, you're right.
The fight stated getting more intense. They didn't notice that Claymore had made it to the general area around the office. 96. Claymore Grimtomb says,
So, I made it in time.
Claymore aims his rifle at the undead horde. He starts firing at the undead. Luke David Copeland says,
It looks like we have some help.
Dwayne Chris Patton says,
We're going to win this after all.
The team had fought back against the undead. Several hours have passed. It is now early morning. The team had managed to kill the remaining undead. Dwayne Chris Patton says,
That was close.
Luke David Copeland says,
We've finally won.
Huck Abberton says,
Yes. We finally won. Even though we suffered many losses, we've survived through this whole ordeal.
Lirahan Whitelight says,
Yeah.
Lirahan notices Claymore. Lirahan Whitelight says,
Hey, Mr. Abberton.
Huck Abberton says,
What is it?
Lirahan Whitelight says,
Claymore is here.
Huck sees Claymore. Huck Abberton says,
I see him now.
Huck goes to the front door. He opens the front door. Claymore enters the office. Huck Abberton says,
Thanks for your help.
97. Molly Tweedleby says,
Yeah. What happened to the rescue party?
Claymore Grimtomb says.
They died.
Molly Tweedleby says.
That's rather tragic.
Luke David Copeland says.
I just realized something.
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
What is it?
Luke David Copeland says.
We're the only survivors of this whole ordeal.
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
You're right.
Molly Tweedleby says.
What are we going to do now?
Julio Alvarado says.
She does have a point.
Huck Abberton says.
Well, due to recent events, we would have to cancel this year's summer season at Camp Fallen Oak.
Julio Alvarado says.
That's rather unfortunate, but it's for the best.
Huck Abberton says.
At least we can recover from this.
Luke David Copeland says.
Hey Dwayne.
Dwayne Chris Patton says.
What is it?
Luke David Copeland says.
You still have that date with Molly.
98. Dwayne Chris Patton says.
You're right.
Dwayne turns to Molly. Dwayne Chris Patton says.
Hey Molly, do you still want to go out on a date?
Molly Tweedleby says.
Of course.
Huck Abberton says.
Now that it's settled, we'll call your parents to come pick you up.
The 4 teens agree. They go back to their cabins to get their gear. Huck proceeds to call their parents. Huck Abberton says.
That's done.
Julio Alvarado says.
It's unfortunate that this camping season ended so quickly.
Huck Abberton says.
Yes.
Julio Alvarado says.
You're mourning all the deaths.
Huck Abberton says.
Yes. So many people have died over the course of the past day.
Julio Alvarado says.
Yes.
Claymore Grimtomb says.
I'll be going now.
Huck Abberton says.
Goodbye.
Claymore leaves the area. The teens' parents arrive to pick up the teens. Huck Abberton says.
See you next year.
99. Campers says.
See you next year.
The campers leave. Dwayne gets on his cell phone and calls Molly. Julio Alvarado says.
What's next on the list?
Huck Abberton says.
We call the proper authorities to perform a cleanup operation.
Julio Alvarado says.
Good idea.
Huck proceeds to call the relevant authorities. They proceed to send transports to pick up the remains. They also send a crew. Huck Abberton says.
I'm surprised that we made it through the night.
Julio Alvarado says.
Yeah.
The pair soon go about closing down the camp. They soon go their own ways. Julio Alvarado says.
See you next year.
Huck Abberton says.
See you next year.
The pair go their own ways. Fade out. Roll end credits.